Hi, I'm Ryan Hightower. I am a full-stack developer and lead engineer at yours.co. I'm a software engineer with an emphasis on prototyping and product validation, two interests of mine. And right now, we're going to show you how to get started with Vue.js, and we're going to discover what it really means to be a progressive JS framework. Progressive framework, you say. What does that even mean? So we're going to back up for a second, because that's not... This was working literally seconds ago.
All right, who has the blocker? Do an internet blocker. Good? Is it working?
Oh, maybe it is now. Hold on 1 second. Oops, that's not right. How does this work? See? Testing. 1, 2, 3. Oh, there we go. Okay. Should I start over for the camera?
Yes. You're good.
Okay. All right, full stack developer, lead engineer at yours.co. We're going to look at Vue.js. So what do you mean by a progressive framework? Evan Yu shared this graphic with us actually at this conference last year, UtahJS 2016. And he was explaining the problems that we're trying to solve in our applications happen at different complexity levels. So things here like declarative rendering, using logical components to build up our views, using client-side routing for navigating between views, and so on. These are only necessary after a certain point in our project when we reach a certain complexity. So when you add them too early, it creates some unnecessary complexity in our tooling. So Vue.js was built with this in mind to be this idea of being incrementally adaptable to these different levels of complexity. It would not only scale up to meet the need to solve some of these really big problems on the end of that scale, but it also scales down really nicely to handle these very minimal cases without being overkill. So today we're going to look at those first 4 levels of complexity and see how Vue meets the needs of our applications. So again, declarative rendering, components, client-side routing, and finally, large-scale state management. So disclaimer, this is a lot of ground to cover. This is going to be a broad overview. If you're familiar with Vue already, you might not see anything new today. If you're coming from React or Angular, however, hopefully this sort of wide survey will help you see some of the trade-offs that you might be making should you decide to use Vue in a future project. And if you're brand new to JavaScript frameworks, welcome. I don't know where you've been for the last 4 years, but get ready to have your mind blown. So here's our code example we're going to be using throughout the presentation. This is a section of an e-commerce site that I built several years ago using PHP and jQuery. You can see it's a form that was meant to guide customers through what was actually a rather complex purchasing process. We've simplified things here just for demonstration purposes. But you can see in this example as soon as it gets back, on the first page here, you can select between different styles of product. You can add a number of students that it's going to calculate the right materials for you. It only shows the right materials that you want to use, that you want to actually purchase based on those answers. And then it lets you add them to your cart and ultimately go ahead and check out. So here's what the code looks like. First, our HTML. We're focusing just on the first view here, that questionnaire form, for just a moment. Here we have 3 sections that we're going to show and hide to guide the user through this form. In these sections, you can see we have a bunch of inputs. We have a radio button to select our styles. We have a text input to enter the number of students, and a submit button that will submit the questionnaire form and move us on to the next section. We also have these continue buttons inside each section, which serve to actually show and hide or reveal the next section in the sequence. And here's our JavaScript code. Don't worry, it's intentionally unreadable. We're using jQuery to grab a bunch of DOM elements. Then we use it to show and hide the elements when the continue buttons are clicked. Then we're doing some validation over here, and then it just goes on and on and on and on. And about 300 lines or so for this one view. You've probably all had this experience before. We think, oh, this is just a simple task. I'll just use jQuery. And then as more requirements are added to the project, it just balloons, and it just becomes terrible to maintain. So let's see how we can fix some of this using declarative rendering. Now, keep in mind that this is a core function that most JavaScript frameworks give us today. I mean, that's why we have so many JavaScript frameworks right now. So let's take a look at what makes declarative rendering so great. So we all know how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, right? So I ask you, how do you make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? What would you say? Well, if I had never made a peanut butter and jelly sandwich before, you might have to tell me imperatively how to make a sandwich. And those instructions might look something like this. Pull out 2 pieces of bread, grab the peanut butter and jam from the fridge, get out a knife, lay the pieces of bread on a flat surface, open the peanut butter, dip the knife in the peanut butter jar, and scoop about 2 tablespoons worth of, and on and so on. The number of steps can quickly get very long because you have to be very specific about how things are executed. Now, in a declarative process, things happen a little differently. Make a sandwich. Give sandwich to child. Enjoy some of the hidden snacks while your child is occupied, but do it quick because they can sense when somebody is eating sugar in the house. In our declarative process, all those inconsequential steps have all been abstracted away into a system or a framework that understands the declarative commands that we're giving it. In this case, make a sandwich. So here's a real question. How does Vue help us with this? So let's look at our questionnaire again, this time using the Vue framework. Right off the bat, we've reduced almost 300 lines of code down to just 45. It actually fits on the screen now. Everything else has been abstracted away into a very concise 60 kilobyte library. We also have a much more formal structure, you can see. That makes it a lot easier for us to follow once we know the conventions of Vue. So anybody who knows Vue can immediately step into this and see what's going on. So you can see here we're creating a new instance of Vue and mounting it to an element on the page with an ID of app. And we have a data object here, which is where we store our data that we want to use reactively in our project. And Vue is going to watch the data in here for us, and when things are updated, it will automatically trigger updates in the DOM. Then we have a methods block that where we can define any functions we want to use on our data. So we'll come back to those blocks in just a second. Here's our HTML again for the questionnaire form. The most important thing that has changed here, though, is the addition of some interesting attributes on some of our elements. In Vue, these attributes are called directives. So directives in Vue are special attributes that apply reactive behavior to the DOM. So nothing more, nothing less. If you're coming from Angular 1 or some other framework, that might have this is all this means for Vue. So we'll take a closer look at these directives we're using here. The first one being vShow. So vShow shows and hides elements, just as the name suggests. And it does that based on a Boolean value, which you can see described in our data object here. So my highlight's a little off, but Q2, Q1, or show section Q2 here translates to the Q2 false here. So that's going to be hidden when it first comes up. The second directive we're interested, for this example, interested in is vOn. And this adds an event listener directly to our DOM element. It's going to, vOn takes a parameter that defines which event to listen to. In this here you see click is being passed right after the colon. Then in the attribute's value, between the quotes, we tell it which handler in our methods to use. So this can be any of the functions in our methods object, in the methods objects of our Vue instance. So this method is currently toggling the show values, so our vShow directive can actually reveal our sections in sequence. Since vOn is such a common directive, it actually has a shorthand version using just the @ symbol. So here we're using @click to capture the click on the submit button. And then we're passing it to the submit questionnaire handler so we can do some validation before submitting it. And we'll look at that in the next slide. vModel is another directive that's super important. It gives us access to data binding in our forms. This means whenever the user updates a form field, we'll see that change reflected directly in our data model. So you can see the vModels there. Now that we have the data out of our DOM, we can easily do things like validation. So here we see our call to our validation method when we submit the form, and then that method just makes some comparisons on our data. And if everything passes, then we go ahead and submit the form just using vanilla JavaScript. No special syntax needed there. And here you can see a demonstration of the data binding as we make changes to the form. Down in the bottom right there, you see the data model is actually updating in real time. So if all you're going to use Vue for was as a simple library to provide declarative rendering, it would be worth it. It takes so little setup, even compared to other modern JavaScript libraries, that it really makes it my first choice for these scenarios. But lucky for you, it gets even better. Components now take things to a whole new level where we're thinking about breaking down our code into pieces of UI that are more maintainable and even reusable. So we'll take a look at another example here. We've already taken the time to refactor our questionnaire form in this code sample. So let's see how a component is structured. Now first, we're going to wrap it in the view.component and pass it a name as the first parameter. And then the second parameter is a configuration object, which is really similar to our original Vue instance. We have our data object and the methods object just like before. But this time we see our data object is actually a function. It's returning a data object. So for those who are familiar with Angular or the hazards of scope, this convention creates a unique scope for each of our components, so we can actually put multiple of the same component or multiple instances of the same component on the page at at a time, and they won't override each other. So we also have a new property now called template. And here we're actually going to move all of our HTML out of our index.html and pass it into our template property here for the questionnaire. Then we update our view component with a new components property. That's where we pass in our newly created component. And to render it on the page, you can see we throw a tag up there with the component using the element's name in kebab case. So that was easy. We already know what this one looks like because we saw it before. So we're going to move on. Here's a look at our second component. This is our product list. And the product list sounds like something that we might want to reuse in other places of our e-commerce site. So like the other category pages or even on the review cart page. So this is where components get really interesting because we can use that new element to just drop on the page, and we can make it configurable and dynamic, so it dynamically adapts to the page depending on the context. So, and that's the rendered component there. Now we're going to dive into the code for our product list and see how we make it dynamic. First of all, you can see here we're defining a component property or prop called products that can be a list of products to show on that page. So the actual value of my products array is getting defined somewhere up the stream in the hierarchy, and then it gets passed down into our component at runtime. The other thing we see here is that we're nesting a product row component inside our product list component. And we're even passing a prop for product into that product row component. So we can go as deep as we need to go, but this makes our views very composable. So here we have our product list component, and you can see our 3 product row components nested inside it. Okay, that was a sprinting fast overview of components. Components are awesome, but we also need some way to quickly switch between them, or we're just stuck making server requests all day to switch between views, which if we're building a single-page application, doesn't really make it a single-page application. So introducing client-side routing, the third peak on our journey through complexity. Up until now, we've been working with just the core JS, the core Vue library. Vue Router is actually a Vue plugin, so it's officially supported by the core Vue.js team, and obviously pairs really nicely with Vue. This is where Vue starts to become more of a robust framework by adding these additional plugins. So let's get routing. We're going to declare a new instance of Vue Router. The router takes a config option. Oop, looks like my highlights are messed up. Okay, we've got the router has a config object, which takes one parameter, routes. And routes is just an array of route definitions. And each of these definitions is just an object with a path and the component that you're going to route to. So then we'll add our router to our main Vue instance so that it gets mounted on the page. And then we add the route view component to see our work. So now that our routes are set up, let's add some navigation to our page. First, we'll use the router link component to render out some navigation. And we're going to use this progress bar as our temporary navigation bar. So we add the router link objects here for each of our steps. And these links are actually rendering out anchor tags, as you can see below there. But our HTML was built using a list. So not a problem. Router link has a way to solve that. We can pass it a property called tag with the attribute of li, and it's going to render out li tags instead of anchors. And here you can see our navigation working. So one last note about routing, because we can actually navigate programmatically too. Here we've isolated the submit button from our previous questionnaire component. So every component used in ViewRouter actually has the router injected into that component. So we can access it on any component using the $router property. So if we want to navigate programmatically here in our submit questionnaire handler, we can do all of our validation and stuff, and when we're ready to go, we say $router.push, and it's going to push it's going to take us to that URL, pushes that onto our browser history state, and takes us there. Okay. So ViewRouter is a full-featured client-side router with support for things like nested routes, named views to render multiple components at once, route guards to use with authorization, lifecycle hooks, and it has really become a very robust routing solution. Okay, on to our final topic, what you've all came for, hopefully, state management. As your application grows, you'll have more and more components, and they'll need to talk to each other, and they'll want to share data. And the more and more this happens, it gets to a point where it becomes really important for us to ensure that our data is being handled in a very predictable way. Otherwise, we get lots of unexpected states, and debugging across hundreds of components where you don't know where the state is changing really gets to be a nightmare. So enter Vuex. Like the Vue router, Vuex is actually an officially supported plugin for the Vue framework. Vuex is a library, but it's actually it's a state management pattern as well. It was inspired by the Flux pattern. So if you're familiar with Flux and Redux, then this has a similar one-way data flow that you'll see. But in my opinion, it's a bit more intuitive. So let's see what that pattern looks like. So we start off with our components, and these are going to get their state from Vuex's store, and then render that to the browser. When something happens in the UI, we're going to dispatch an action, which is simply an asynchronous function that returns a promise. An action might talk with a backend service or an API before continuing. But once that action is done, then it will commit a mutation. And mutations are synchronous functions that make a predictable state, a predictable change on our state. So also with Vuex is part of the library is a set of dev tools that will monitor these state changes made by our mutations, and even lets us walk back in history to view previous states. So we can inspect what changes are being made, which is really helpful for debugging. So now that the state has been updated, it triggers all the updates to the DOM, which with batch updating, this gets rendered back to the browser with the new state, and then we wait for another action, and the cycle continues. So let's look at how we actually implement Vuex in our e-commerce site. We'll take a look at our product component, and we'll implement an add to cart method that uses these actions and mutations to update our cart. So first, we'll set up our Vuex store. And here we have the state with our cart object and our answers and everything that we had before. Here we see our mutations. And then each mutation is a function that gets passed our store's current state and an optional payload for adding to the mutation. Then we can manipulate that state however we need to. So here we are incrementing the quantities of the products in the cart. And then we get to our actions. So each action gets passed a context. That context includes both our store's state and also the ability to commit a commit function which executes our mutations. We can also pass an optional payload here. The context in our actions is not an instance of our Vuex store. It's actually a little bit different. The reason for that is eventually our state will get to a point where we'll want to be able to modularize it as well and break it out into its own components. So Vuex supports modules, which the context gets passed along with that as part of the module system. So in this action, it looks like we're actually going to talk to some asynchronous API here for our e-commerce site. And then on success, we will commit our add to cart mutation to update the cart in our state. So now we're going to jump back into our product list component code and take advantage of this add to cart action in Vuex. So first of all, I want to point out that our data object still exists here. We don't have to use Vuex to store all of our data. We're actually going to connect our vModels to this local cart property while the user is still interacting with the form. And then when they're done, we can actually commit it to our global Vuex state. In our computed properties, this is where we're going to be grabbing data from our Vuex store. So like the Vue router, Vuex actually gets injected into every component in the application. So we can do anything we need to in the store just by accessing it using the $store property. So now in our methods, we finally get to implement our add to cart method. And after some validation, we're going to utilize our $store to dispatch our add to cart action, passing it our local cart data. So then that add to cart action will speak to our API and cause all the mutations on our state. And here we can see the result of our work. So down at the bottom, you see the Vuex DevTools open. And we see that the product quantities in the cart all start at 0. And then we add to cart. And when that finishes, we can see that the object has been updated. And then on the left-hand side, we can walk back and forth through our mutations and see the changes that it made. Okay. And there you have it. That was a lightning-fast overview of Vue across some different levels of complexity. Again, I'm Ryan Hightower. Check us out at yours.co. We have some very cool changes coming in October. If you have any questions or comments about Vue or about this presentation, I would be more than happy to talk with you. Please connect with me. You can find me at my social handle, Ryan Hightower, super easy, for Twitter and GitHub, LinkedIn, whatever. Also, email me at ryan@yours.co. I don't get enough emails, so And if for some reason you just don't like me or my presentation, or I went too fast or something, I apologize. I have a special inbox for you to use. If you use it, I promise I will reply. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ryan. We have time for probably about 5 questions from the audience. So any questions? Ryan, if you would repeat the questions as they're asked.
Yes.
So it seemed to me like it was very, very similar to like the other frameworks. Why would you use Vue over, say, Angular or React?
Very good question. Okay, so the question is, why would you use Vue over Angular or React since they look so very similar? How much have you used Angular?
I used Angular 1. I haven't really done much Angular 2.
Okay, Angular 1, and you're asking me this question. No, I'm just kidding. No, it's a fair question. Angular 1 comes with a lot of tooling complexity. We just briefly sort of skimmed over that at the beginning. Angular 1 is, Angular itself, even Angular 2, is great for large-scale, stable applications. It was built for testing, and so it does that really well. Vue, on the other hand, grew out of a need to build rapid prototypes, and so its focus is a lot different. It's built to get up and running really fast. In the course of a half-hour presentation, we basically built a whole application, a mini application complete with state management. So that's where Vue really shines, is getting off the ground really fast, and it still happens to scale up really well to larger applications. In my mind, it competes a lot better with React than it does Angular. React and Vue are very similar. I happen to like the additional conventions that Vue gives. It doesn't feel so loosey-goosey to me. And so it's really, I don't think there's a right answer when it comes to JavaScript frameworks. I'm very of the opinion that you use which flavor suits you best. Vue happens to suit me really well, and I don't know, maybe it suits some of you too. So. Yes?
So how familiar are you with Polymer and Redux? How does Vue shine against those as a more minimalistic approach to quick prototyping?
So the question is, how does Vue and Vuex compare against Polymer and Redux? I haven't used Polymer extensively, so I'd have a hard time thoroughly answering that question. I've looked at it a little bit, and I can't say that I know anything other than it felt a little bit more cumbersome to me. Redux in general feels more cumbersome to me than Vuex does. It's more of a flavor thing. Using actions and mutations seems a lot more intuitive than this functional programming and reducers and things. So from that perspective, yes. Go try them both, then come back and let me know.
Could you just give us a quick example of the scalability of Vue, where it's like come in really handy or save like time on a project?
The question is, can I give an example of where of the scalability of Vue, where it's really saved a project? On the e-commerce app that I showed here, it took too much time to build that jQuery component. and we later came back and we had to redo the whole thing because we were adding a second sort of questionnaire. And it was just like a nightmare to try to adapt it to the new flow. So we said, scrap it, and we threw in Vue on it, and what took us a couple weeks the first time took us a day or two the second time. So yeah, that's it's actually still in use on that project. That's a smaller use case. We're using it right now at YoursCo as part of a Firebase application, and there's definitely trade-offs, but so far it's working really well for us. And I'll let you know in a month or two. We just started about 3 or 4 weeks ago, so on that project. Yes?
Can you use ES6 syntax with Vue to like do arrow functions and stuff like that?
The question is, can you use ES6 syntax? I don't know if you noticed, but I actually was using ES6 syntax in our example here. But yes, Vue, some of the things that we didn't get to in this presentation are the things like build tools that are available. And Vue actually was the first one to come out before React or Angular with its own CLI to initiate your application, and it comes complete with testing baked in and Webpack. And the Webpack setup with Vue is awesome. You can ES6 to your heart's delight with that setup.
Last question.
So I've heard you say trade-off a couple of times, but you haven't been specific. What would you say the biggest trade-off that you've run into?
The biggest trade-off I've run into is the testing. The tooling for testing isn't really there yet. They tout that it's just JavaScript, so you can test it like anything else, and that's true to an extent. But some of the patterns that are, or some of the conventions that are common, makes it. There's not a lot of examples out there to follow. So they're working on some tooling for testing right now, and I'm hearing good things about it. I can't wait for it to come out.